The rain struck the tall windows of Somerton Hall with a violence that matched Alexander Pembroke's mood as he stood in his study. The devastating financial reports spread across his mahogany desk like accusations. September 15th, 1814 would be remembered, he thought bitterly, as the day he finally admitted defeat. His steward had departed mere minutes ago, his weathered face grave as he delivered news of yet another failed harvest, the third in as many years. The numbers swam before Alexander's eyes in the lamplight, each column of red ink another nail in the coffin of his family's 300-year legacy. He moved to the window, watching the storm lash the ancient oaks that had stood sentinel over Pembroke land since the time of the Tudors, and wondered if he would be the earl who lost it all. The study door opened without ceremony, and he knew without turning that his mother had come to deliver her daily sermon on duty and sacrifice. Lady Catherine Pembroke swept into the room, her black bombazine rustling with disapproval, her sharp eyes taking in the scattered papers and the glass of brandy he had poured but not yet touched. "Wallowing in self-pity accomplishes nothing, Alexander," she announced, settling herself in the chair before his desk as though preparing for battle. "You know perfectly well there is a solution at hand." He turned from the window, meeting her steely gaze with his own. "If you mean to speak of Thornhill's offer again, Mother, I beg you to spare us both the indignity." Her thin lips compressed into a line of displeasure. "Indignity? What indignity is there in saving your estate, your tenants, your very name from ruin? The girl comes with £50,000, enough to clear every debt and restore Somerton to prosperity." The girl. Not Miss Thornhill, not Margaret, just the girl, as though she were livestock at market. Alexander felt the familiar rise of bile in his throat at the thought of selling himself to the highest bidder, of becoming the very thing he had always despised in others of his class who had bartered their names for merchant gold. Yet what choice remained? He thought of his tenants, good families who had worked Pembroke land for generations, who would be turned out if he could not pay the mortgages. He thought of Diana Ashford, radiant Diana who had smiled so sweetly when accepting his suit 2 years ago, only to break their engagement the moment news of his financial troubles reached London society. "She would not want such a cold alliance any more than I," he said finally, but the protest sounded weak even to his own ears. Lady Catherine rose, her expression softening marginally. "Want? My dear boy, what has want to do with anything? She is 8 and 20, firmly on the shelf, plain as a sparrow by all accounts. Her father is desperate to see her settled, and we are desperate to avoid ruin. It is a practical arrangement that benefits all parties." She moved to the door, pausing to deliver her final thrust. "I have sent word to Mr. Thornhill that you will call upon them in London on the 20th. Do not make me a liar, Alexander. The Pembroke name depends upon it." As the door closed behind her, Alexander finally reached for the brandy, downing it in one burning swallow as thunder shook the ancient walls, and he made the decision that would alter the course of his life forever. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Margaret Thornhill sat in her father's library on the morning of September the 20th, 1814, her hands folded quietly in her lap, the grey wool of her dress as unremarkable as she knew herself to be. Through the heavy oak door, she could hear the servants bustling about, preparing for the Earl of Somerton's arrival, their whispered gossip carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "The proud Earl, forced to come begging for merchant money," one maid tittered to another. "And our poor Miss Margaret the price of his salvation." Margaret did not flinch at their words, having long ago accepted her role as her father's most disappointing investment, a daughter too plain and too clever to attract a husband through conventional means. The bronze inkwell on her father's desk caught the morning light, reminding her of all the letters he had written to various potential suitors over the years, each one eventually returning with polite refusals. She had hidden her volume of Byron's poetry beneath a cushion when she heard the carriage approaching, knowing her father would disapprove of her reading material when there were accounts to be reviewed and household management to be studied. The door to the library opened with authority, and Thomas Thornhill entered, followed by a man who could only be Lord Pembroke. Margaret's first impression was of height and harsh angles, a face carved from granite and about as welcoming. His dark eyes swept over her in quick assessment, and she saw the barely concealed disappointment in them as he took in her modest appearance, her brown hair pulled back in a simple knot, her features that had been kindly called pleasant by those too polite to say plain. Her father immediately launched into enthusiastic discourse about shipping ventures and profit margins, while the Earl stood stiffly near the fireplace, his attention clearly wandering. Margaret remained silent, as was expected, though she noticed how his gaze occasionally drifted to the books lining the walls, lingering on the gilt-lettered spines with something almost like longing. When her father paused to pour brandy, the Earl's eyes met hers briefly, and she saw a flicker of something unexpected there, perhaps recognition of a fellow soul trapped by circumstance. "You have an extensive library, Mr. Thornhill," Lord Pembroke observed, his cultured voice carrying a note of genuine interest that seemed to surprise him. "My daughter's doing, mostly," her father replied dismissively, "though I've told her repeatedly that too much reading fills a woman's head with impractical notions." Margaret felt the Earl's gaze upon her again, more searching this time, and when he noticed the corner of the red leather volume peeking from beneath the cushion beside her, his lips quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Byron, Miss Thornhill?" he asked quietly, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks at being discovered. "You are familiar with his work, my lord?" she responded, lifting her chin slightly, daring him to mock her as others had done. "She walks in beauty, like the night," he quoted softly, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than propriety dictated, and Margaret felt something shift in the air between them, a recognition that perhaps neither of them was quite what they appeared to be, before her father's booming voice shattered the moment, drawing the Earl's attention back to matters of money and marriage contracts. The moment Mr. Thornhill departed to retrieve the marriage contracts from his study, leaving them alone in the suddenly oppressive quiet of the library, Margaret felt the weight of the Earl's scrutiny like a physical presence, though he had turned toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that spoke of barely contained tension. The silence stretched between them, thick with all that remained unspoken, until Margaret found herself breaking it with words that surprised even her with their directness. "You need not pretend enthusiasm, Lord Pembroke. We both know what this is." He turned sharply, his dark eyes widening slightly at her boldness, and she saw something flicker across his austere features that might have been respect or merely surprise that the merchant's daughter possessed a spine. "Miss Thornhill, I assure you," he began, but she raised a hand, a gesture so improper that it made him pause mid-sentence. "Please, my lord, let us at least have honesty between us, if nothing else. You need my father's money to save your estate, and he needs your title to crown his ambitions. I am merely the currency of exchange." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but there was a strange relief in speaking them aloud, in acknowledging the transaction for what it was rather than dressing it in the false finery of romance. Alexander moved away from the window, coming to stand before her chair, and she was struck again by his height, by the way he seemed to fill the space around him with an authority born of centuries of breeding. "You speak very plainly, Miss Thornhill," he said, and she could not tell if it was censure or admiration in his tone. "I have been rejected by 7 suitors, my lord, for being too plain and too clever by half. I see no point in pretending to be otherwise now. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to lower her eyes as a properly demure maiden should, and was rewarded by seeing something shift in his expression. 7 fools, then, he said quietly. And the unexpected defense of her intelligence made her breath catch. Cleverness in a woman should be prized, not punished. Before she could respond to this extraordinary statement, her father bustled back into the room, his arms full of documents, his face flushed with the excitement of closing the deal of his lifetime. Here we are, he exclaimed, spreading the papers across his desk with the same enthusiasm he showed for shipping manifests. October 10th, I thought, at St. George's in Hanover Square. Gives us time for the banns and preparations. Margaret watched as Lord Pembroke reviewed the contracts with the careful attention of a man who understood exactly what he was signing away, his long fingers steady as he took up the pen. Though she noticed the almost imperceptible pause before he set his signature to the paper that would bind them together. When it came her turn to sign, she moved to the desk with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout this mortifying process, aware that both men were watching her, one with satisfaction at a bargain well struck, the other with something harder to define. As she set her name below his on the contract, she felt the Earl lean slightly closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You deserve better than this, Miss Thornhill. She looked up at him then, searching his face for mockery and finding instead a genuine regret that caught her off guard, and managed a small smile that held all her accumulated resignation. We rarely get what we deserve, my lord. We make do with what we are given. The profound sadness that crossed his features at her words stayed with her long after he had departed, leaving her to wonder if perhaps she was not the only one who felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control, if perhaps this proud Earl with his ancient name and empty coffers understood more about cages than she had imagined. The autumn afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Somerton Hall as Alexander led his mother through the newly refurbished rooms that would soon belong to Margaret Thornhill, trying to ignore the disdain that curled Lady Catherine's lips with each step they took across the restored carpets and past the freshly painted walls. So this is what merchant money buys, she said, her voice sharp as winter frost, running one gloved finger along a mantelpiece as if checking for dust, though the room was spotless. I suppose we should be grateful that your bride's father has such deep pockets, even if his blood runs common as ditch water. Alexander felt his jaw tighten at her words, but maintained his composure, remembering too well how his mother's sharp tongue had driven away servants and alienated neighbors over the years. Miss Thornhill will make a perfectly adequate countess, mother, he said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth, remembering Margaret's quiet dignity as she had signed her name to their devil's bargain. Adequate? Lady Catherine laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. How far the house of Pembroke has fallen that we must content ourselves with adequate. I've invited Diana Ashford to the wedding, by the way. I thought it would be instructive for your merchant's daughter to see what a true lady looks like, what you might have had if circumstances had been different. The casual cruelty of it made Alexander's hands clench into fists, but before he could respond, she had swept from the room, leaving him alone with his shame. He found himself wandering to the portrait gallery, that long corridor where generations of Pembroke wives gazed down from gilded frames, each one a celebrated beauty of her day, each one bringing noble blood and substantial dowries to strengthen the family line. There was his grandmother, the Duke of Marlborough's daughter, with her famous sapphire eyes and swan-like neck. His own mother, painted in her youth, when she had been called the Toast of London, before bitterness had carved lines around her mouth. And soon, Margaret Thornhill would hang here, with her plain brown hair and unremarkable features, a constant reminder of how low he had been forced to stoop. The shame of it burned in his chest like acid, not for his own pride, but for what he was doing to an innocent woman who deserved better than to be bartered like livestock. The sound of boots on marble announced Philip Greville's arrival before his oldest friend appeared in the doorway, taking in Alexander's brooding contemplation of his ancestors with a knowing look. "Having second thoughts about your merchant bride?" Philip asked, though his tone was gentle rather than mocking. "It's a business arrangement, nothing more," Alexander replied automatically, but the words rang hollow even to his own ears. "Is it?" "Because the Alexander I knew at Cambridge would have starved before marrying for money alone. What's really troubling you?" Alexander turned from the portraits to face his friend, suddenly weary beyond his years. "She's not what I expected, Philip. She's intelligent, well-read, dignified in the face of humiliation. When she signed that contract, she looked at me with such resignation, such acceptance of her fate, as if she's used to being disappointed. And in 5 days I'll stand before God and promise to honor her, knowing that I'm just another in a long line of people who have failed to see her worth." Philip studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Then perhaps, my friend, you might consider being the first to prove her wrong." The morning of October the 10th dawned grey and uncertain, matching perfectly the knot of anxiety that had taken residence in Margaret Thornhill's stomach as she stood before the modest looking-glass in her childhood bedroom, watching her maid arrange the simple wreath of orange blossoms in her unremarkable brown hair. The white muslin dress she wore had been her mother's, carefully preserved these many years, its modest cut and lack of ornamentation a stark contrast to the elaborate gowns she knew would fill St. George's Church in less than an hour. Through the window, she could hear the bells already beginning their celebratory peal, though celebrate seemed too generous a word for what was about to transpire. The carriage ride to Hanover Square passed in a blur of London's morning bustle, her father sitting across from her, practically vibrating with satisfaction at having secured an earl for his daughter, seemingly oblivious to the fact that said daughter looked more like she was heading to her execution than her wedding. The church loomed before them all too soon, its grand columns and imposing facade a reminder of the world she was about to enter, a world that had already made its opinion of merchant daughters quite clear. As she alighted from the carriage, clutching her small bouquet of white roses with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to still them, she caught sight of the gathering crowd of wedding guests, their fine clothes and haughty expressions marking them as members of the ton who had come to witness the Earl of Somerton's fall from grace. The whispers began before she had even reached the church doors, carrying on the crisp October air like poisoned arrows. "Good heavens, is that the bride? She looks like a shop girl." What else would you expect from trade? They say Pembroke was days from debtor's prison. At least she comes with a fortune attached, even if nothing else recommends her. Margaret kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her mother's pearl necklace cool against her throat, the only jewelry she wore, the only connection to a woman who might have understood this terrible mixture of duty and dread. Inside the church, the assembled nobility filled the pews like exotic birds of paradise, their jewels catching the light from the tall windows, their fans fluttering as they leaned together to share their observations about the merchant's plain daughter who had bought herself a title. And there, near the altar, stood Alexander Pembroke, devastating in his dark mourning coat, his face a mask of aristocratic composure that might have been carved from marble for all the emotion it showed. But as she began her long walk down the aisle, her father's arm steady beneath her hand, she saw something flicker in those dark eyes, something that looked almost like pain when he took in her simple dress, her modest appearance, the way she held herself with quiet dignity, despite the obvious scorn of his peers. Beside him, she noticed with a sinking heart, stood Diana Ashford in a gown of celestial blue silk that made her look like an angel descended to earth, her golden beauty a deliberate contrast to the bride's plainness, her presence a calculated cruelty that had Lady Catherine Pembroke's fingerprints all over it. The ceremony itself passed in a strange fog, the minister's words washing over her as she stood beside this stranger who would be her husband, aware of every whisper, every titter, every cruel comparison being drawn between herself and the radiant Diana. When the time came to speak her vows, her voice emerged steady and clear, though she felt Alexander start slightly when her hand trembled in his as she promised to love, honor, and obey. Then, in a gesture so unexpected it nearly undid her careful composure, he squeezed her hand gently, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in what could only be interpreted as reassurance, and when she looked up at him in surprise, she found him looking back at her with something in his expression that she had never seen before, something that looked almost like understanding, perhaps even protection. It was their first genuine moment of connection, brief as a heartbeat, but somehow more real than all the words they had spoken up to this point, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch was careful, almost tender, as if he understood that she was not merely a business transaction, but a person deserving of kindness. The register was signed, the bells rang out their announcement to all of London that the Earl of Somerton had wed Miss Margaret Thornhill, and as they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, she felt the weight of every stare, heard every cutting remark about mismatched couples and merchant presumption, but that gentle pressure of Alexander's hand on hers remained constant, a small anchor in a sea of hostility that suggested perhaps, just perhaps, she had found an unexpected ally in this aristocratic stranger who was now, for better or worse, her husband. The wedding breakfast at Somerton Hall unfolded in the great ballroom like an elaborate theatre production where Margaret found herself cast as the unfortunate lead in a play she had never auditioned for, seated at the high table in her simple white muslin dress, while around her swirled the cream of London society in their silks and satins, their jewels catching the afternoon light that streamed through the tall windows, their voices rising and falling in waves of conversation that pointedly excluded the new Countess of Somerton. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, maintaining the same quiet dignity that had carried her through the ceremony, though she felt each cutting glance like a physical blow, each whispered comment about the merchant's daughter and her bought title landing with the precision of an expert marksman finding their target. The elaborate feast spread before them might as well have been sawdust for all she could taste, her throat tight with the effort of maintaining her composure while being so thoroughly ignored by her husband's guests, who seemed to look through her as if she were made of glass, invisible and insignificant. It was Diana Ashford who broke the careful bubble of isolation that Margaret had constructed around herself, gliding over in a rustle of celestial blue silk, her smile as false as paste jewels as she settled beside the new bride with the air of a cat who had cornered a particularly helpless mouse. "My dear Countess," she purred, and the title dripped from her lips like honey laced with poison. "How overwhelming this must all be for you, adjusting to a world so very different from what you're accustomed to. The tongue can be rather unforgiving to those who don't quite understand its little nuances." Margaret felt her spine straighten instinctively, years of facing rejection having taught her to recognize an attack when she heard one, and she turned to face Diana with a smile that was pleasant, if not warm. "How kind of you to concern yourself with my adjustment, Miss Ashford," she replied, her voice steady and clear, "though I find that good manners and genuine kindness translate quite well across all levels of society. Perhaps that's a nuance some have forgotten." The subtle barb found its mark, she saw with satisfaction. as Diana's perfect features tightened almost imperceptibly. But before the beauty could respond, Lord Wetherby rose unsteadily to his feet, his glass raised high and his face flushed with too much wine. "A toast!" he bellowed, and the room fell silent, all eyes turning to him with the eager anticipation of those who sensed impending entertainment at another's expense. "To the Earl of Somerton, who has shown us all that even the proudest lineage has its price, and to his bride, who proves that money can indeed buy anything in modern England, even if it cannot buy refinement." The laughter that followed was cruel and sharp, cutting through the air like shards of broken glass, and Margaret felt the heat rise in her cheeks despite her best efforts to remain unmoved. But even as she reached for her own glass, prepared to weather this fresh humiliation with the same quiet grace she had endured all the others, she became aware of Alexander rising beside her, his movement so sudden and forceful that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. The laughter died instantly as the Earl of Somerton stood to his full, impressive height, his dark eyes sweeping the room with a look that could have frozen fire. And when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of aristocratic authority that reminded everyone present exactly who held the ancient title in this room. "My lords and ladies," he began, and there was something in his tone that made even the boldest among them shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I thank Lord Wetherby for his toast, inadequate though it may be. Allow me to offer a more accurate one." He lifted his glass, and Margaret noticed with surprise that his hand was perfectly steady, despite the tremor of controlled fury she could sense running through him. "To my bride, Margaret, Countess of Somerton, whose intelligence surpasses that of most men I know, whose grace in the face of unwarranted rudeness shames us all, whose understanding of finance has already uncovered ways to improve the estate that I, with all my supposed breeding, had overlooked. To a woman who brings not just material wealth to this union, but a wealth of character, wisdom, and dignity that makes me realize how very fortunate I am, how very undeserving of such a partner." The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire room had collectively forgotten how to breathe, and Margaret found herself staring up at her husband in shock, this man who had just publicly defended her with a ferocity she had never expected, who had praised qualities in her that she had been told all her life made her undesirable. Around them, she could feel the shift in the room's energy, the recalculation happening behind all those carefully composed faces as they reassessed the dynamics of this marriage they had all been so quick to mock. Diana Ashford's perfect features had arranged themselves into a mask of barely concealed fury, while several of the other ladies were now looking at Margaret with something that might almost have been respect, or at least a wariness that suggested they would think twice before offering another insult. As Alexander resumed his seat, Margaret caught his hand briefly under the table, squeezing it in a gesture of gratitude that she could not yet put into words. And when he returned the pressure, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in that same reassuring gesture from the church, she felt for the first time since arriving at Somerton Hall that perhaps she was not quite as alone in this glittering, hostile world as she had believed. The evening shadows had lengthened across Somerton Hall by the time Alexander made his way through the quiet corridors toward Margaret's chambers, the emotional exhaustion of the day weighing on him like a physical burden as he contemplated the conversation that must now take place between them. The delicate matter of their sleeping arrangements that propriety demanded be addressed, despite the strange reluctance he felt to maintain the distance that he had originally assumed would be essential to this business arrangement. He knocked softly on her door, hearing her quiet voice bid him enter, and found her standing by the tall windows that overlooked the moonlit grounds, still wearing her wedding dress, though her maid had clearly been dismissed, the simple white muslin glowing ethereally in the silver light that streamed through the glass, making her look younger and more vulnerable than she had appeared even during the ceremony. She turned at his entrance, and he saw the quick flash of apprehension cross her features before she schooled them into that same quiet composure she had maintained throughout the trying day. Though he noticed the way her hands clasped together, the knuckles white with tension, as she clearly steeled herself for what she assumed would be his assertion of his husbandly rights. "My lord," she began, her voice admirably steady, despite the circumstances, "I understand that there are certain expectations regarding this evening, and I want you to know that I am prepared to fulfill my duties as your wife, though I confess I am not entirely certain of the proper procedures, having had no mother to advise me in such matters." The words struck him with unexpected force, the quiet dignity with which she offered herself up for what she clearly viewed as an unpleasant obligation, and he found himself crossing the room quickly, his hands raised in a gesture of reassurance. "Margaret, please, that is not why I've come," he said, noting how she started slightly at his use of her given name, the first time he had done so without the formal address. "I wanted to discuss our living arrangements, yes, but not in the way you seem to fear. I think, given the circumstances of our marriage, it would be best if we maintained separate chambers, at least for now, until we have had time to become better acquainted." The relief that flooded her features was so profound that it made him feel like even more of a cad for putting her in this position, and she sank into a nearby chair as if her legs could no longer support her. "You are very kind, my lord," she whispered, and there was something in her voice that suggested she had expected far worse from this day. "May I offer you some wine?" he asked, moving to the sideboard where a decanter had been placed, needing something to occupy his hands, to break the strange intimacy of the moment. "We have survived quite an ordeal today, and I think we have earned a moment of peace." She accepted the glass gratefully, and they sat in companionable silence for a moment before she spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "It was worse than I expected, yet also better," she mused, staring into the ruby depths of her wine. "I had prepared myself for cruelty, having experienced it often enough in London ballrooms, but I had not expected kindness, especially not from you." Her honesty disarmed him, as it had from their first meeting, and he found himself responding in kind. "I must apologize for my family's behavior, particularly my mother's decision to invite Miss Ashford. It was unconscionably cruel." Margaret's laugh was soft and without bitterness. "Your mother seeks to protect what she sees as your interests. I cannot fault her for that, even if her methods are rather severe. Besides, Miss Ashford's presence served to highlight what everyone was already thinking about the contrast between what you deserve in a bride and what you have been forced to accept." The self-deprecation in her tone sparked an unexpected anger in him, not at her, but at a world that had taught this intelligent, graceful woman to see herself as somehow less than. "You speak of what I deserve as if you have nothing to offer beyond your father's money," he said, setting down his glass with more force than necessary. "Yet in one day I have seen you face down the cruelest gossips of the ton with more dignity than most of them could muster in a lifetime, respond to deliberate provocations with wit and grace, and maintain your composure through circumstances that would have reduced Diana Ashford to hysterics." She looked at him with surprise, a faint colour rising in her cheeks. "You give me too much credit, my lord. I have simply learned that there is little point in railing against what cannot be changed. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds," she quoted softly, then seemed to catch herself, adding quickly, "Not that I speak of love between us, of course, but rather of the general principle of accepting circumstances with grace." The Shakespeare quote, delivered with such unconscious eloquence, reminded him of their first meeting, her book of poetry hastily hidden, the intelligence in her eyes that had first made him look beyond her plain exterior. "Sonnet 116, he identified, surprising her again. "You seem shocked that an earl might know his Shakespeare. Forgive me," she said, but there was a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth now. "I have learned not to expect literary discourse from most gentlemen of the ton. They seem to prefer their entertainment in other forms." They talked then, as the moon rose higher and the wine warmed them both, about books and poetry, about the estate and her observations during the brief tour she had been given, about anything except the strangeness of their situation, and Alexander found himself relaxing in a way he had not done in months, perhaps years. She had a sharp mind and a dry wit that emerged more clearly as she became comfortable, and he realized with some surprise that he was genuinely enjoying her company. When at last he rose to take his leave, noting the lateness of the hour, she stood as well, and for a moment they faced each other in the moonlight, two strangers bound together by necessity, yet perhaps finding in each other something neither had expected. "Thank you, my lord," she said softly, "for your kindness today and for this evening. You have made an unbearable situation bearable, and I am more grateful than you can know." He took her hand then, bowing over it with genuine courtesy rather than mere form. "It is I who should thank you, Margaret. You have handled yourself with a grace that puts us all to shame. I think perhaps this arrangement of ours might prove more pleasant than either of us anticipated." As he left her chambers and made his way back to his own rooms, Alexander found himself replaying the evening's conversation. The way her face had transformed when she smiled, the unexpected pleasure of finding an intellectual equal where he had expected only a necessary burden, and for the first time since his steward had delivered the news of his financial ruin, he felt something that might almost have been hope stirring in his chest, though he could not quite name what it was he was hoping for. The morning sun cast long shadows across the estate grounds as Alexander entered the small office adjoining the library, expecting to find his steward, but discovering instead his wife bent over the account ledgers, her plain morning dress of dove-grey wool making her seem to blend into the subdued colors of the room, except for the way the autumn light caught the rich brown of her hair, which she had pinned up simply without the elaborate arrangements favored by ladies of fashion. She was so absorbed in her calculations that she did not hear him enter, her pen moving swiftly across the page as she made notations, occasionally pausing to check figures in another ledger spread open beside her, and he found himself watching her work with growing fascination, noting the fierce concentration on her face, the way she bit her lower lip when puzzling over something particularly complex. "Margaret," he said softly, not wishing to startle her, and she looked up with a start, color flooding her cheeks, as she realized she had been caught trespassing in what was traditionally male domain, though he noticed she did not attempt to hide what she had been doing, meeting his gaze with that direct honesty he was coming to appreciate more each day. "Forgive me, my lord," she began, though her tone suggested she was not particularly sorry. "But I noticed some discrepancies in the household accounts when reviewing the monthly expenses, and I thought perhaps I might be of assistance, given my familiarity with such matters from helping my father with his business concerns." He moved closer, genuinely curious now, and she shifted to allow him to see her work, pointing to columns of figures with ink-stained fingers as she explained how certain expenses had been inflated, how suppliers were charging significantly more than market rates, how simple changes in purchasing patterns could save the estate hundreds of pounds annually. Her voice grew animated as she spoke, losing the careful modulation she usually employed, and he found himself captivated not just by the keen intelligence of her analysis, but by the transformation in her entire demeanor when she was engaged in something that truly interested her. "This is remarkable," he said, and meant it, seeing months of financial strain potentially alleviated by her sharp eye and practical knowledge. "My steward has been managing these accounts for 20 years and never noticed these issues." She smiled then, a real smile that lit up her features in a way that made him wonder how he had ever thought her plain. Men of business often develop comfortable relationships that are not always in the best interest of their employers, she observed. My father taught me to question every expense, to verify every charge, to never accept that something must be done a certain way simply because it has always been done that way. They spent the next hour going through the accounts together, and he found himself impressed not just by her financial acumen, but by her diplomatic suggestions for implementing changes without causing undue offense to long-standing suppliers and servants. When finally they set aside the ledgers, he impulsively suggested they ride out to inspect some of the tenant farms, wanting to see if her practical intelligence extended to agricultural matters as well. She accepted with an enthusiasm that suggested she had been feeling confined within the formal rooms of Somerton Hall, and within the half-hour they were mounted and riding through the crisp October morning, her seat on horseback as competent as everything else about her, though she rode with the practical efficiency of one who viewed horses as transportation rather than fashion statements. As they visited the tenant farms, Alexander watched in growing amazement as Margaret displayed a natural affinity for the farming families, asking after children by name, though she had met them only once before, inquiring about specific concerns with genuine interest, offering suggestions that revealed an understanding of agricultural principles that must have come from her merchant father's dealings with rural suppliers. Mrs. Hartley, the wife of one of their largest tenants, positively beamed as Margaret admired her kitchen garden and asked for advice about herbs that might grow well in the sheltered corners of Somerton's formal gardens, while old Mr. Crawford, who had barely acknowledged Alexander's previous visits with more than a grunt, became positively loquacious when Margaret asked his opinion about a new strain of wheat she had read about in an agricultural journal. "You've won them over completely," Alexander observed, as they rode away from the last farm, unable to keep the admiration from his voice. "They barely tolerate me, their lord of 30 years, yet they speak to you as if you were a favorite daughter." The wind had loosened tendrils of her hair from their pins, creating a soft frame around her face, and her cheeks were pink with exercise and autumn air as she turned to him with dancing eyes. "Perhaps because I speak to them as people rather than possessions," she suggested gently. "Your tenants are the backbone of your estate, my lord. Their prosperity ensures yours, their knowledge invaluable if you would but ask for it. My father may be new to wealth, but he understood from the beginning that success comes from alluring those who contribute to it, whether they be clerks in his warehouse or farmers supplying his goods." As they crested the hill that gave the best view of Somerton Hall, nestled in the valley below, its golden stone glowing in the afternoon sun, she reined in her mount to admire the prospect, and Alexander found himself watching her rather than his ancestral home, seeing how the enthusiasm of the day had transformed her entire appearance, how animation and purpose had revealed a vitality that formal social occasions seemed designed to suppress. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and there was something in her voice that made him think she was seeing not just the aesthetic appeal of the great house, but the potential in its lands, the lives it sheltered, the community it anchored. "My father would say it's a crime to let such resources be mismanaged when a little attention and practical sense could make it flourish again." He moved his horse closer to hers, struck by a sudden desire to share his own vision for the estate. The dreams he had harbored before financial crisis had reduced everything to mere survival. "What would you do," he asked, "if you had free rein to implement changes?" Her eyes lit up at the question, and as they rode slowly back toward the hall, she outlined ideas that ranged from crop rotation schemes to establishing a school for tenant children, from renegotiating supplier contracts to hosting quarterly gatherings that would strengthen the bonds between estate and community. And with each suggestion, Alexander felt something shifting inside him, a recognition that what he had seen as a business arrangement had brought him something far more valuable than mere money. The library at Somerton Hall had become their evening sanctuary, a warm refuge where the rest of the world seemed to fade away beyond the tall windows that now reflected the dancing flames from the hearth rather than the darkening October sky. And it was here that Alexander found himself looking forward to each night with an anticipation that he refused to examine too closely, telling himself it was merely the pleasure of intellectual companionship after years of vapid social conversation. Margaret was already there when he entered, seated at the small table near the fire where their chessboard waited, the pieces arranged precisely as they had left them the previous evening, when she had executed a particularly clever gambit that had left him delightfully outmaneuvered, though he suspected now that she had been allowing him to win their earlier games out of some misguided sense of deference to his masculine pride. "Good evening, my lord," she said, looking up from the book she had been reading, and he noticed how the firelight caught the amber flecks in her brown eyes, how it warmed the pale skin of her throat where it emerged from the modest neckline of her evening dress, a soft blue wool that she had worn several times before, but which seemed to suit her far better than the elaborate gowns favoured by ladies of fashion. "I was just reading Wollstonecraft's Vindication," she continued, a slight challenge in her voice, as if expecting him to object to her choice of such controversial material. "And I find myself quite in agreement with her views on female education, though I suspect that makes me even more of a blue-stocking than society already believes me to be." He settled into the chair across from her, reaching for the brandy decanter that had become part of their evening ritual, pouring for himself and offering her the sherry she preferred, using the familiar motions to mask the way his pulse had quickened at her defiant tone, the spark of intelligence and passion that transformed her features whenever she spoke of something that truly engaged her mind. "And what particular aspect of Miss Wollstonecraft's arguments do you find most compelling?" he asked, genuinely curious, having discovered over these past 2 weeks that Margaret's opinions were always well-reasoned and often challenged his own comfortable assumptions in ways that he found increasingly stimulating. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes brightening with enthusiasm as she launched into a detailed analysis of the author's central thesis, her hands moving expressively as she spoke, occasionally reaching out to move a chess piece absently, while making a particularly emphatic point about the artificial limitations placed on women's intellectual development by a society that preferred ornamental wives to thinking partners. As she spoke, Alexander found himself watching the play of emotions across her face. The way her brow furrowed when she was formulating a particularly complex thought, the slight smile that curved her lips when she scored a rhetorical point, and he realized with a start that he had completely lost track of her actual argument, so mesmerized had he become by the woman herself rather than her words. "You disagree?" she asked suddenly, misinterpreting his silence, and there was a note of disappointment in her voice that made him want to reassure her immediately, to tell her that he could listen to her debate philosophy and politics and literature for hours without ever growing bored, that her mind was one of the most attractive things about her, though he knew such an admission would reveal far more than he was prepared to acknowledge even to himself. "Not at all," he said quickly, forcing himself to focus on the conversation rather than the dangerous direction of his thoughts. "I was merely considering how different my life might have been had I married a woman who could challenge me intellectually as well as manage a household, though I suppose society would say that makes me quite radical in my views." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to determine whether he was mocking her, then moved her queen across the board in a maneuver that he belatedly realized had been carefully planned several moves in advance, the kind of strategic thinking that would have impressed him in any military commander, but which seemed even more remarkable in a woman who had been taught to hide such abilities behind false modesty and deliberate incompetence. Check. she said softly. And there was something in her voice that suggested she was testing more than just his king's position on the board, pushing boundaries that had been carefully maintained between them despite their growing friendship. He studied the board, looking for escape routes, but she had planned too well, each potential move blocked by pieces she had maneuvered into position while he had been distracted by their conversation, and he found himself snarling at the elegance of her trap even as he recognized his defeat was inevitable. "I concede," he said, tipping over his king with a rueful laugh. "Though I begin to suspect you have been allowing me to win our previous games, which hardly seems sporting of you, madam." The smile that spread across her face then was unlike any expression he had seen from her before, mischievous and delighted and utterly transformative, turning her from the quiet, self-effacing woman society saw into something altogether more vibrant and alive, and he felt his breath catch at the sight of it. "Perhaps I thought your masculine pride required careful handling," she teased, her voice taking on a lighter quality that he had heard hints of before, but never quite so clearly. "Though I see now that you are made of sterner stuff than most gentlemen of my acquaintance, who tend to become quite petulant when bested by a mere female." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with new appreciation, seeing not the plain merchant's daughter he had reluctantly agreed to marry, but a woman of remarkable intelligence and subtle humor who had been hiding her true self behind a mask of proper feminine subservience. And he wondered how many other surprises she might reveal if he could convince her to lower her guard completely. "Play me again," he said impulsively, beginning to reset the pieces. "And this time show me no mercy, for I find I would rather lose honestly to a worthy opponent than win through false victories." As they began their new game, the conversation flowed as easily as the wine, ranging from estate business to philosophical debates to playful verbal sparring that had an edge of something else beneath it, something that crackled in the air between them like the fire in the hearth. And when she reached for a fallen pawn at the same moment he did, their fingers brushing in a contact that seemed to burn despite its brevity, they both froze for a moment that stretched between them like a held breath. She withdrew her hand first, color rising in her cheeks as she busied herself with studying the board. But he had seen the way her pupils had dilated at the contact, felt the tremor that had run through her fingers, and he knew with sudden, startling clarity that whatever was developing between them was not one-sided, that she felt it too, this unexpected attraction that had grown from intellectual respect into something far more dangerous to both their carefully maintained boundaries. "It grows late," he said abruptly, standing with less than his usual grace, needing to put distance between them before he did something foolish, like reach for her hand again, this time with intent rather than accident. "And we have an early morning tomorrow with the estate manager coming to review the improvements you suggested." She nodded, not quite meeting his eyes as she rose as well. But as he turned to leave, she called his name softly, and when he looked back, she was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, vulnerability mixed with something that might have been longing if he had allowed himself to name it as such. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing me as more than just a convenient solution to your financial difficulties, for allowing me to be myself, rather than expecting me to play a role I was never suited for." He wanted to tell her then that she had become so much more than that these evening conversations had become the highlight of his days, that he found himself thinking of witty observations to share with her during the most mundane moments, that her opinion had somehow become more important to him than anyone else's. But the words stuck in his throat, too revealing, too dangerous, too true. "Good night, Margaret," was all he managed, but something in his voice must have betrayed him, because her eyes widened slightly before she turned away, busying herself with banking the fire, and as he left the library and made his way to his solitary chambers, He admitted to himself what he had been fighting against for days now, possibly since that first morning when she had shown him her practical brilliance over the account books, certainly since she had charmed his tenants with her genuine warmth and interest in their lives, that he was falling in love with his convenient bride, and the realization terrified him more than any financial ruin ever could, because this was not something that could be solved with careful planning or strategic maneuvering. This was his heart at stake, and he had no idea what to do about it, no idea if she could ever return feelings that had grown from such an inauspicious beginning, no idea how to bridge the gap between what they were and what he increasingly desperately wanted them to be. The village of Somerton was ablaze with autumn colour on the 2nd day of November, as carriages and carts converged on the green for the annual harvest fair, and Margaret stood beside Alexander at the entrance to the main pavilion, resplendent in the new blue pelisse he had surprised her with just that morning, its rich sapphire wool setting off the warm tones in her hair and bringing out a sparkle in her eyes that made him wonder yet again how anyone could have ever called her plain. She was clearly in her element here among the merchants and farmers, moving through the crowds with a natural ease that reminded him she had grown up attending such events with her father, learning to judge the quality of goods and the character of those who sold them, skills that now served her well as the Countess of Somerton negotiating prices for preserves and winter vegetables with the local farm wives who had initially eyed her with suspicion, but now clustered around her eagerly, drawn by her genuine interest in their recipes and household wisdom. He watched with growing pride as she handled the delicate balance between maintaining her position and showing authentic warmth, never condescending, yet never allowing familiarity to cross into disrespect. And when old Mrs. Pemberton pressed a jar of her famous apple butter into Margaret's hands, with instructions on how best to serve it with roasted pork, his wife's delighted thanks were so sincere that the elderly woman actually blushed with pleasure. The whispers had started almost immediately upon their arrival, as he had known they would, for the local gentry were always quick to gossip about the earl who had married beneath his station, and the merchant's daughter who had bought her way into the nobility. But Margaret seemed utterly unaware of the pointed looks and hushed conversations, or perhaps she had simply chosen to rise above them with the same quiet dignity she had shown at their wedding breakfast. It was Lord Ashworth who finally crossed the line from whispered speculation to open insult, the younger son of a neighbouring estate who had always resented Alexander's higher rank, and now saw an opportunity to strike at what he perceived as weakness, approaching them near the livestock pens with an oily smile that did nothing to mask the malice in his pale eyes. "Ah, Pembroke," he drawled, making an elaborate bow that managed to be insulting in its very perfection. "And the new Lady Pembroke, of course, though I suppose we should call her the merchant countess, should we not, since she has brought such valuable skills to your estate, knowing how to haggle over prices like any common tradeswoman." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Alexander felt rage surge through him with an intensity that surprised him, not the cold anger he might have felt at an insult to his own honour, but something far more primal and protective, the fury of a man watching someone he loved being attacked by a creature too small and petty to recognize true worth when it stood before him. "You will apologize to my wife immediately," he said, his voice carrying the kind of icy authority that had made stronger men than Ashworth step back in fear. "Or we will settle this matter in whatever manner you prefer, though I should warn you that I am considered quite proficient with both pistol and sword." But before Ashworth could respond, Margaret placed a gentle hand on Alexander's arm, the touch somehow both calming and electrifying, and when she spoke, her voice was perfectly composed despite the slight tremor he could feel through her fingers. "There is no need for apologies or challenges, my lord," she said, addressing Alexander, though her words were clearly meant for their unwanted companion. "For Lord Ashworth merely speaks the truth as he sees it, and I am indeed the daughter of a merchant. Trained in the skills of commerce and negotiation, abilities I consider neither shameful nor common, but rather essential for anyone who wishes to see an estate prosper rather than decline through mismanagement and aristocratic pride. She turned then to face Ashworth directly, and there was something in her steady gaze that made the younger man take an involuntary step backward, as if recognizing for the first time that beneath her modest appearance lay a strength of character he could never hope to match. "I find it curious, however," she continued in that same calm tone, "that you would consider such skills beneath notice when your own family's estate has been mortgaged 3 times in as many years, according to the public records my father taught me to read, suggesting perhaps that a little common tradecraft might serve the Ashworth holdings well before they are lost entirely to creditors." The colour drained from Ashworth's face as her words found their mark with surgical precision, and he stammered something incoherent before turning on his heel and fleeing, leaving Alexander staring at his wife with a mixture of admiration and something far deeper, something that made his chest tight and his breath catch as she looked up at him with worried eyes, clearly concerned that she had overstepped despite his obvious approval. "That was magnificent," he said softly, not caring who might overhear, and the smile that spread across her face in response transformed the entire fair into something magical, the autumn sun seeming to shine more brightly. The music from the village band taking on a sweeter tone, the very air between them charged with possibility. When the band struck up a country dance in the main pavilion, he did not hesitate to lead her onto the floor, knowing full well that every eye would be upon them, the earl and his merchant bride displaying their partnership before the entire county. And as they moved through the familiar steps, her hand warm in his, her eyes never leaving his face, he realized that he had never been prouder to be seen with anyone in his entire life. The dance seemed to last both forever and mere moments, and when it ended, he kept her hand in his perhaps a moment longer than strictly proper, feeling the pulse at her wrist that told him she was as affected as he by this public declaration of unity. This wordless statement that whatever society might whisper, she was his chosen countess, his partner, his match in every way that truly mattered. As they made their way back through the fair, stopping to admire needlework and taste preserves, to discuss wool prices with farmers and admire the prize-winning sheep, he noticed how the atmosphere had shifted, how those who had whispered behind their hands now nodded respectfully, how Margaret's handling of Ashworth had earned her a different kind of regard, and when they finally climbed back into their carriage as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to echo the warmth in his chest, she turned to him with eyes that sparkled with more than just reflected light. "Thank you," she said simply. But he heard everything she did not say in those 2 words. Gratitude not just for his defense, but for seeing her, truly seeing her, for recognizing that beneath the modest appearance and quiet manner lay a woman of remarkable strength and intelligence, someone worthy of being not just a convenient bride, but a true partner. And as their carriage rolled through the gathering dusk toward Somerton Hall, he found himself reaching for her hand, holding it gently in his own, as she leaned her head against his shoulder with a soft sigh of contentment. And in that moment, with the autumn air crisp around them and the future stretching ahead full of promise, Alexander realized that what had begun as a desperate business arrangement had transformed into something far more precious. Something that no amount of money or land or noble blood could ever purchase. Something that poets wrote about and ordinary people only dreamed of finding. And though he had not yet found the words or the courage to tell her so, he knew with absolute certainty that he loved her. Loved her with a depth and intensity that both thrilled and terrified him. Loved her in a way that made everything else in his life seem pale and insignificant by comparison. loved her as he had never imagined himself capable of loving anyone. And as the lights of Somerton Hall appeared in the distance, welcoming them home, he tightened his grip on her hand just slightly, a silent promise that whatever the future might hold, whatever challenges they might face from society or family or circumstance, they would face them together. United not by contract or convenience, but by something far stronger and more enduring, something that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings into the kind of love that could weather any storm. The dining room at Somerton Hall had been transformed for the occasion of their 1-month wedding anniversary. The November evening made warm and inviting by the glow of countless candles reflected in the polished silver and crystal, and Margaret sat across from Alexander, wearing the golden silk gown he had commissioned for her from London, her mother's pearls glowing softly at her throat, looking more beautiful than he had ever seen her, not because the expensive dress had somehow transformed her appearance, but because happiness radiated from her like light from the candles, making her eyes sparkle and her skin glow with an inner luminescence that had nothing to do with cosmetics or fashion, and everything to do with the joy that seemed to bubble up from within her as they shared a particularly amusing anecdote about Mrs. Pemberton's prize pig escaping during the fair and causing havoc among the flower arrangements. Alexander had spent the entire day planning this evening, dismissing the servants early so they could dine privately, selecting wines from the cellar that would complement each course, even writing out what he intended to say when the moment felt right, the words of love and devotion that had been building inside him for weeks now, pressing against his chest like caged birds, desperate for flight. And as he watched her laugh at the memory of the pig's rampage through the dahlias, he knew the moment was approaching, could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken between them, charged with unspoken emotion and possibility. He was just reaching for her hand across the table, the words forming on his lips, when the dining room door burst open and Philip strode in, his usually composed face flushed with urgency and anger, a crumpled letter clutched in his fist, and Alexander felt his heart sink even before his friend spoke, knowing instinctively that whatever news he brought would shatter this perfect moment like a stone through glass. "Forgive the intrusion," Philip said, though his tone suggested he knew forgiveness was the least of their concerns. "But I've just received word from London that you need to hear immediately, for that witch Diana Ashford has been spreading the most vicious gossip about Margaret throughout society, calling her a mushroom trying to buy her way into their ranks, suggesting that she trapped you into marriage through her father's manipulation, implying that you are so desperate to escape the match that you're already seeking grounds for annulment." The colour drained from Margaret's face as Philip's words registered, and Alexander watched in horror as all the joy and confidence that had been building in her over these past weeks seemed to crumble in an instant, her shoulders curving inward as if trying to make herself smaller, less visible, less of a target for the cruelty of a world that seemed determined to punish her for the crime of being born to the wrong class. Without a word, she rose from the table and fled the room, her golden skirts rustling like autumn leaves in her wake, and Alexander found himself torn between the desire to chase after her immediately and the need to fully understand the extent of Diana's campaign against his wife. But the decision was made for him when Philip handed him the letter, its contents so vile and carefully crafted to wound that he felt rage building in him like a physical force. By the time he reached Margaret's chambers, having taken the stairs 3 at a time in his urgency, he found her pulling gowns from her wardrobe and folding them haphazardly into a trunk, tears streaming down her face as she worked with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had long ago learned to pack quickly when rejection came, as it always seemed to, for women like her who did not fit society's narrow definition of desirability. "What are you doing?" he asked, though the answer was painfully obvious, and she did not look at him as she replied, her voice steady despite the tears. "I'm leaving, of course, returning to my father's house where I belong, where my presence won't embarrass you further, or give your former love more ammunition for her campaign to see you free of an unsuitable wife." He crossed the room in 2 strides, gently but firmly taking the dress from her hands and setting it aside, before capturing her face between his palms, forcing her to meet his eyes, seeing in their depths not just the pain of Diana's current cruelty, but the accumulated wounds of a lifetime of being found wanting, of being the plain daughter, the clever one who made men uncomfortable, the one who was always second choice or no choice at all. "You are not going anywhere," he said fiercely, his thumbs brushing away her tears even as new ones fell. "For you are my wife, my chosen companion, my partner in every way that matters, and I will not allow Diana or anyone else to drive you from your home, from my side, from the place you have carved out in my heart through your intelligence and kindness and strength." She searched his face as if looking for signs of deception or duty-driven kindness, and he could see the moment she began to believe him, her eyes widening with something like wonder. But before he could continue, before he could speak the words of love that pressed against his throat like a physical thing demanding release, the door burst open again, and Lady Catherine swept in with Diana herself at her side. Both women wearing expressions of false concern that did nothing to mask their satisfaction at finding Margaret in such obvious distress. "My dear Margaret," his mother said in tones of poisonous sweetness, "Diana has graciously agreed to stay with us for an extended visit to help with your social rehabilitation, for clearly you need guidance in navigating the complexities of our world, and who better to provide it than someone who understands exactly what is expected of a countess in society." Alexander felt Margaret stiffen under his hands, saw the way her chin lifted with quiet pride, even as Diana's lips curved in a smile that reminded him of a cat contemplating a wounded bird. And in that moment, he wanted nothing more than to bodily throw both women from the room, from the house, from their lives. But he knew such dramatic action would only feed the gossip mills and make Margaret's position even more difficult. So instead he drew his wife against his side in a gesture that was both protective and publicly claiming, feeling the way she trembled slightly before straightening her spine and meeting Diana's malicious gaze with dignity and tact. "How thoughtful," Margaret said, and there was something in her voice that made Diana's smile falter just slightly, a steel beneath the silk that suggested the merchant's daughter might not be the easy prey she had anticipated. "Though I confess I am curious what qualifications you possess for such instruction, Miss Ashford, given that you yourself have yet to secure a husband or establish your own household, remaining instead dependent on the hospitality of friends and relations who grow, I'm told, increasingly weary of your extended visits." The breakfast room at Somerton Hall had never felt more oppressive than it did on that grey November morning, the very air seeming to thicken with malice as Diana Ashford held court at the table, her beauty arranged to maximum effect in a morning gown of palest pink that made Margaret's practical brown wool look even more drab by comparison, though Alexander noticed with a surge of protective anger that his wife had chosen to wear his grandmother's cameo brooch, a small act of defiance that proclaimed her rightful place as mistress of the house, even as Diana systematically undermined her with every honeyed word. "Dear Margaret," Diana purred, reaching for the marmalade with studied grace, "I do hope you slept well. Though I imagine adjusting to such grand surroundings must be quite overwhelming when one is accustomed to more modest accommodations." And Lady Catherine nodded approvingly from her place at the head of the table, clearly relishing this opportunity to see her unsuitable daughter-in-law put in her place by someone who understood the nuances of their world. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, and Alexander saw the way she steadied it through sheer force of will, maintaining a dignified silence that somehow made Diana's cruelty more apparent than any response could have, though the slight tightening around her eyes told him how deeply each barb struck home. I was just telling Lady Catherine about the delightful picnic you organized for me last summer, Alexander, Diana continued, her voice taking on a wistful quality that made his stomach churn. When we spread that blanket by the lake, and you read Byron to me for hours, feeding me strawberries between verses, such a romantic afternoon, though I suppose you have little time for such frivolities now that you have estate matters to attend to. And the implication hung heavy in the air that Margaret was a burden, a business obligation that prevented him from pursuing more pleasurable companionship. He watched his wife's face carefully compose itself into a mask of polite interest, even as the colour drained from her cheeks. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, despite the hurt he knew she must be feeling. "How lovely, Miss Ashford. Though I confess I find Byron rather overwrought for my taste, preferring the quiet wisdom of Wordsworth or the sharp wit of Austen. Authors who understand that true feeling need not announce itself with theatrical gestures, but often speaks most eloquently through restraint and dignity." Diana's perfect smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, turning to Lady Catherine with a conspiratorial air that excluded Margaret entirely. "Perhaps we should organize some small gatherings to help ease dear Margaret's transition into society. Nothing too ambitious, of course. Just intimate soirees where she can observe how things are properly done before attempting anything more public, for we wouldn't want any embarrassing mistakes that might reflect poorly on the family name." The words were perfectly calculated to wound, suggesting that Margaret was not merely unsuitable, but unteachable, a permanent embarrassment to be managed rather than a countess in her own right. And Alexander felt rage building in his chest like a physical force as he watched his mother nod enthusiastically at the suggestion, clearly delighted to have found an ally in her campaign to make Margaret feel perpetually inadequate. "What an excellent idea," Lady Catherine said, her tone dripping with false concern. "For while Margaret has many admirable qualities, I'm sure the duties of a countess require a certain innate refinement that cannot simply be learned from books or ledgers, a natural grace that comes from generations of good breeding, though of course we shall do our best to help her approximate the proper standards." And Alexander saw the way Margaret's knuckles whitened as she gripped her teacup, the only outward sign of the pain these women were so deliberately inflicting. He had endured enough, could not sit there another moment watching the woman he loved be tortured by those who claimed to care for his well-being while showing such callous disregard for hers. And when Diana began another anecdote about some past romantic moment they had shared, clearly designed to emphasize Margaret's status as second choice, something inside him snapped with an almost audible sound. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through Diana's performance like a blade through silk, and the sudden silence that fell over the breakfast room was absolute, even the servants freezing in place as they recognized the dangerous tone that had sent lesser men fleeing in terror. "Miss Ashford, while your concern for my wife's social education is noted, I find myself compelled to point out that Margaret has shown more grace, intelligence, and true nobility in the few weeks of our marriage than you have displayed in all the years of our acquaintance, and I will not sit here another moment listening to your thinly veiled insults disguised as helpful guidance." He rose from his chair with deliberate control, moving to Margaret's side and offering her his hand, which she took with a mixture of surprise and gratitude that made his heart ache for all the times she must have faced such cruelty alone, without anyone to stand as her champion. "My wife requires no instruction in how to be a countess, for she has already proven herself superior to those who would judge her by the circumstances of her birth rather than the quality of her character. And if you find her company so unsuitable, Miss Ashford, perhaps you should consider cutting short your visit to seek more agreeable accommodations elsewhere." The colour drained from Diana's face as she realized she had overplayed her hand, that her attempts to drive a wedge between Alexander and Margaret had instead revealed the depth of his protective feelings, while Lady Catherine sputtered in outrage at this unprecedented defense of the merchant's daughter over a woman of their own class. But Alexander cared nothing for their shock or anger, leading Margaret from the room with his head held high and her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm. Once in the corridor, away from those poisonous voices and judgmental eyes, Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression a mixture of wonder and confusion that made her look heartbreakingly vulnerable. "Thank you for defending me, my lord, though you need not have been so harsh on Miss Ashford's account, for I understand that the bonds of past affection cannot be easily severed, and if you find that her presence brings you comfort or stirs pleasant memories, I would not wish to be the cause of any rift between old friends." The words struck him like a physical blow, the realization that even after his passionate defense, she still believed he might prefer Diana's polished beauty to her quiet strength, that she saw his protection as duty rather than desire, and he found himself speechless for a moment, staring down at her earnest face as she continued with that same devastating misunderstanding of his feelings. "I know that I am not what you would have chosen if circumstances had been different, and I can bear Diana's presence if it pleases you, for I have endured far worse than a few cutting remarks, and I would not have you sacrifice friendship for the sake of a wife you never wanted in the first place." And with those words, delivered so matter-of-factly despite the pain behind them, she gently withdrew her hand from his arm and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the corridor with the crushing realization that she had no idea whatsoever that he had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with her. The November wind rattled against the windows of Alexander's study as he poured himself another measure of brandy, his hands trembling slightly not from cold, but from the overwhelming weight of the realization that had been building in him for weeks, a truth so profound and unexpected that he had fought against acknowledging it even to himself until this moment when denial was no longer possible. And across from him, Philip Greville sat with the patient expression of a man who had been waiting for his friend to reach an inevitable conclusion, the firelight casting dancing shadows across the room as the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke in earnest, sending sheets of rain against the glass in a percussion that seemed to echo the tumult in Alexander's chest. "I am completely and utterly in love with her," he said finally, the words emerging as if torn from somewhere deep within him, and Philip's lips curved in a smile that held no surprise whatsoever, only a gentle satisfaction that suggested he had seen this coming long before Alexander himself had recognized the symptoms of his own transformed heart. "The entire estate has known for weeks, my friend. Everyone from the scullery maid to the head groom has noticed how you watch her when you think no one is looking, how your entire demeanor changes when she enters a room, how you find excuses to seek her company, even when there is no practical reason to do so, and the only person who seems blissfully unaware of your feelings is Margaret herself, though that is hardly surprising given how carefully you have hidden them behind walls of propriety and duty." Alexander groaned, burying his face in his hands as he considered the mess he had made of everything. The way he had allowed Diana's presence to poison what had been growing between them, creating doubt where there should have been certainty, distance where there should have been closeness. And when he looked up again, his eyes held a desperate determination that Philip recognized from their days at Cambridge, when Alexander had set his mind on some seemingly impossible goal. "I must tell her immediately," he declared, already half rising from his chair. But Philip held up a cautioning hand, his expression growing serious as he leaned forward to impart news that made Alexander sink back into his seat with renewed despair. "Before you go charging off on your white horse, you should know that Diana has been filling Margaret's head with the most insidious poison these past days, constantly reminding her that she is merely a second choice, a practical solution to a financial problem, implying that you tolerate her presence while yearning for what you have lost. And I fear Margaret has begun to believe these lies, withdrawing more each day into a protective shell that will be difficult to breach. The brandy burned in Alexander's throat as he absorbed this information, rage building at Diana's deliberate cruelty toward a woman whose only crime had been to save his estate, and in doing so, save him from the empty existence he had not even realized he was living, until Margaret's quiet presence illuminated all the shadows in his life, and he found himself pacing before the fireplace, his mind racing as he considered how best to counter Diana's campaign of emotional destruction. "There must be something we can do to remove her from this house," he said, his voice low and dangerous in a way that made Philip glad they were on the same side of this conflict. "For I cannot bear another day of watching her chip away at Margaret's confidence, making her doubt her own worth when she is the most valuable thing in my life, more precious than this estate, than my title, than anything I have ever possessed or achieved." Philip withdrew a letter from his coat pocket with the satisfied expression of a man producing a winning hand at cards. "As it happens, I took the liberty of making some inquiries about our dear Miss Ashford's current circumstances, and it seems her own financial situation is far more precarious than she would have anyone believe, for her father's investments have failed spectacularly, leaving her with barely enough to maintain appearances, which explains her sudden renewed interest in renewing your acquaintance, despite having rejected you quite thoroughly when your own fortunes were in decline." Alexander seized the letter, scanning its contents with growing satisfaction as he realized the ammunition it provided, not for mere revenge, but for protection of the woman he loved. And as he wrote hasty notes to his London solicitor and several well-connected friends who could verify and expand upon this intelligence, the storm outside seemed to intensify, lightning illuminating the room in brief, dramatic flashes that matched his mood perfectly. "Once we have confirmation of her circumstances, she will have no choice but to leave when I make it clear that I am aware of her fortune hunting," he said with grim satisfaction. But then his expression softened as his thoughts returned to Margaret. "Though removing Diana is only half the battle, for I must find a way to make Margaret understand that she was never second choice, that what I felt for Diana was a pale shadow compared to the depth of feeling she has awakened in me, that she has transformed not just my estate, but my very soul." Philip watched his friend pace the room like a caged lion, noting the way Alexander's entire being seemed to vibrate with the need to go to Margaret immediately, to pour out his heart in a torrent of words that had been held back too long, and he felt a deep satisfaction in seeing the man he had known since boyhood finally awakened to the kind of love that transformed mere existence into living. "You know," Philip observed quietly, swirling his own brandy as the storm raged outside, "I have watched you for years moving through life as if you were performing a role written for you by others, doing your duty, maintaining appearances, following the path laid out by generations of Pembrokes before you, but since Margaret arrived, it is as if you have finally stepped off that predetermined stage and into your own authentic life, and the change is quite remarkable to witness." Alexander paused in his pacing to consider these words, recognizing their truth in the way his chest tightened with emotion, for Philip was right that Margaret had somehow given him permission to be himself, rather than the cardboard cutout of an earl he had been portraying for so long, and as he stood there in his study with the storm raging outside and his heart raging within, he began to rehearse the words he would say to her, discarding flowery speeches in favor of simple truth, knowing that Margaret, with her preference for Wordsworth over Byron, would value honesty over elaborate romantic gestures. "I will tell her that she has made me a better man," he said softly, more to himself than to Philip. "That her kindness has taught me the true meaning of nobility. That her intelligence has shown me how impoverished my own education was, despite all its advantages. That her quiet strength has revealed my own weakness, and that I cannot imagine a future without her in it, not because of duty or gratitude or even friendship, but because I love her with every fiber of my being, and will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of the gift of her presence in my life." The clock on the mantel chimed midnight as the two men sat in companionable silence, the storm beginning to abate outside, as if nature itself recognized that the tempest in Alexander's heart was storm enough for one evening. And as Philip finally rose to take his leave, he clasped his friend's shoulder with genuine affection, noting that it was like watching someone come alive after years of sleep, a Lazarus of the heart who had needed not divine intervention, but simply the quiet presence of a merchant's daughter who saw past titles and wealth to the man beneath. And Alexander knew that come morning, regardless of Diana's schemes or society's judgments or even Margaret's own doubts, he would find a way to make her understand that she was not just his choice, but his only choice, the one woman who could save not just his estate, but his very soul from the emptiness that had threatened to consume it before she arrived to illuminate his world with her gentle light. The conservatory at Somerton Hall had become Margaret's sanctuary in the days since Diana's arrival, a glass cathedral filled with the scent of earth and growing things where she could tend to beauty without fear of cutting remarks or pitying glances, and it was here that Alexander found her on that grey November afternoon, her hands gentle among the winter roses as storm clouds gathered beyond the glass walls, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow that seemed to match the melancholy he had noticed settling over her like a shroud since his former love had taken up residence in their home. She did not turn when he entered, though he knew she was aware of his presence by the way her shoulders tensed slightly, her fingers stilling on the crimson petals of a rose that bloomed despite the season, a small miracle of persistence that reminded him painfully of Margaret herself, flourishing in the face of adversity, yet somehow made more fragile by the very strength that allowed her to endure. "You have been avoiding me," he said softly, moving closer until he could see her profile reflected in the rain-spotted glass, noting the shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and the way she had begun to make herself smaller again, as if trying to disappear into the background of her own life, retreating from the confidence she had begun to show before Diana's poison had seeped back into their world. "I thought it best," she replied, her voice carefully neutral in that way he had come to recognize as her shield against pain. "For Miss Ashford clearly requires your attention, and I would not wish to interfere with the renewal of such a cherished friendship, particularly when my presence seems to cause her such distress, though I confess I cannot understand why the sight of me should trouble someone so blessed with beauty, wit, and every social grace I so obviously lack." The words cut him more deeply than any blade could have, this evidence of how thoroughly Diana's campaign had succeeded in making Margaret doubt not only his feelings, but her own worth, and he found himself moving without conscious thought until he stood directly before her, gently taking the pruning shears from her hands and setting them aside so that nothing stood between them but the truth he could no longer contain. "Margaret, you must listen to me," he began, his voice rough with emotion as he watched her eyes dart away from his, focusing on anything but his face. "For I can no longer bear this terrible misunderstanding between us, this distance that Diana has created with her, lies and manipulations, when the truth is that you have transformed my entire existence, awakened me to possibilities I never imagined, shown me that everything I thought I knew about love was merely a pale shadow compared to what I feel when I look at you." She shook her head, a bitter smile touching her lips as she tried to step back, but he gently caught her shoulders, holding her in place with a touch that begged rather than demanded. "Please, Alexander, you need not pretend for the sake of duty or pity, for I understand what I am and what I am not, and I would rather live with honest indifference than false declarations meant to salve your conscience or maintain household peace. So let us speak no more of this and return to the cordial arrangement we had established before." Her words, her terrible resignation to being unloved, shattered something inside him. And without further thought he pulled her against him, crushing his mouth to hers in a kiss that held all the desperation, longing, and truth he had been unable to put into words, pouring his very soul into that connection of lips and breath and thundering hearts. For a moment she stood frozen in his arms, and then she was kissing him back with an abandon that spoke of her own hidden feelings, her hands fisting in his coat as if she could hold on to this moment forever. And when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he saw tears streaming down her face, even as her lips remained parted in wonder and confusion. "Do not ask me to be your consolation prize," she whispered brokenly, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain that had begun to lash against the conservatory roof. "For I think it would kill me to be the woman you settled for when you could not have the one you truly wanted. To spend my life knowing that when you close your eyes, it is her face you see, her name you wish to speak, her absence you mourn even as you do your duty by me." He was about to protest, to swear that Diana meant nothing, that Margaret was everything, when the conservatory door burst open and a footman rushed in, his face white with panic. "My lord, come quickly, your mother has collapsed in the music room, and Dr. Morrison has been sent for, but we fear the worst." And in an instant the world shifted, personal anguish giving way to family crisis as Margaret transformed before his eyes, the broken woman becoming the capable mistress of the house as she took charge with a calm efficiency that reminded him once again why he loved her so desperately. "Send word to Dr. Morrison that he must come immediately," she instructed the footman with an authority that brooked no argument. "And have Mrs. Pemberton prepare the blue bedroom with extra braziers for warmth. Then ensure that Lady Catherine's personal maid brings her laudanum and the violet salts, while I shall go to her directly." And she was already moving, Alexander forgotten in her urgent need to help, to heal, to hold together a household that had shown her nothing but cruelty, proving once again that her heart was greater than all their prejudices combined. Thunder crashed overhead as they rushed through the corridors together, the storm outside echoing the tempest in Alexander's heart as he watched Margaret take control of the situation, her own pain set aside in service to others, and he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that he could not let another day pass without making her understand that she was not second choice, not consolation, not duty or gratitude, or any of the lesser emotions she had assigned to his feelings, but the great love of his life, the woman without whom his future held no meaning. And as they reached his mother's side, her face pale against the pillows while Diana stood uselessly in the corner wringing her hands, he saw the way the household servants instinctively looked to Margaret for guidance, recognizing in her the true mistress of Somerton Hall, regardless of what society might say about her origins or her face, or any of the 1,000 small cruelties that had been heaped upon her, and he swore that when this crisis passed, he would find a way to make her believe in the love that burned in his chest like a sacred flame, constant and eternal, and hers alone until his last breath left his body. The candlelight flickered across Lady Catherine's pale features as dawn crept through the heavy curtains of her bedchamber, painting the walls in shades of pearl and ash that seemed to echo the fragility of life itself. And Margaret sat beside the great bed with a basin of cool water and soft cloths, her movements gentle and efficient as she tended to the woman who had shown her nothing but contempt since the day she had arrived at Somerton Hall, yet here in this hushed space where death seemed to hover just beyond the edges of perception, all pretense and prejudice had fallen away like autumn leaves before winter's truth, leaving only the essential humanity that connected them as women who had loved, lost, and learned the terrible price of pride. Throughout the long night, Alexander had watched his wife transform the sick room into a haven of quiet competence, directing servants with soft authority, ensuring the fire never died, mixing tisans with herbs from her own garden that seemed to ease his mother's labored breathing. And through it all, she had shown not a trace of the resentment she would have been justified in feeling, only a compassion so pure it made his chest ache with love and wonder at how he had ever been blessed with such a woman. Lady Catherine stirred as the first true light of morning touched her face, her eyes focusing with effort on Margaret's tired but kind expression, and she lifted one trembling hand in a gesture that was unmistakably a request, her voice when it came barely more than a whisper, but carrying the weight of urgent need. "My dear child, I must speak with you alone, for there are things that must be said while I still have breath to say them, truths that have been too long buried beneath the suffocating weight of family pride and societal expectation." Alexander began to protest, unwilling to leave his mother's side when she seemed so fragile, but Margaret touched his arm gently, her eyes communicating that this was important, that some confessions required the intimacy of shared feminine understanding, and so he withdrew to pace the corridor outside, his ears straining for any sound that might indicate a turn for the worse. While inside the chamber, two women spoke truths that would reshape everything. "I was wrong about you," Lady Catherine said, her voice gaining strength as if confession itself was medicine. "So terribly, cruelly wrong, and I see now that my blindness was born not of superiority but of fear. For you see, my dear, I too was once the bride who was deemed unworthy, whose love was considered a degradation of ancient bloodlines, and rather than remember that pain with compassion, I became the very monster who had tormented me, perpetuating a cycle of cruelty that I disguised as maintaining standards." Margaret's hand found the older woman's, holding it with the same gentle firmness she used with everything precious and fragile, and Lady Catherine's eyes filled with tears that seemed to wash away years of carefully maintained coldness, revealing underneath a woman who had once loved with the same desperate intensity that now consumed her son. "My husband's family called me grasping, calculating, said I had ensnared him with feminine wiles, when the truth was we had fallen in love over discussions of poetry in a library, much like the one where you and Alexander spend your evenings, and I let their voices poison what should have been the happiest years of my life, that became hard and bitter in an attempt to prove I belonged, until I no longer recognized the girl who had once quoted Keats to a young man who looked at her as if she held the secrets of the universe. The confession poured out like water through a broken dam, years of suppressed emotion finding voice in this liminal space between night and day, between life and whatever lay beyond. And Margaret listened with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, that complete presence that made the speaker feel truly heard, perhaps for the first time. "But you, my dear, you have refused to let our cruelty change your essential nature, have met every slight with dignity, every insult with grace, and in doing so you have shown me the woman I could have been had I possessed your strength, and I need you to know that my son has never loved anyone the way he loves you, not even that calculating creature Diana who played with his heart like a cat with a mouse. For what he feels for you is written in every glance, every gesture, every word he speaks in your presence." Margaret's composure finally cracked at this revelation, tears sliding silently down her cheeks as she tried to process this unexpected validation from the most unlikely source. And Lady Catherine gripped her hand tighter, urgency lending her strength as she continued her confession, her absolution, her warning all rolled into one. "Do not make my mistake, child. Do not let pride or fear or the voices of those who matter not one whit poison the well of love you have found. For I spent 40 years building walls between myself and the man who adored me, thinking it made me strong when all it made me was alone. And now, as I face whatever comes next, my greatest regret is not the balls I missed, or the gowns I never wore, or the social triumphs that seemed so important, but the nights I spent in separate chambers from a husband who would have held me through every storm had I only allowed myself to be vulnerable enough to ask. The door opened softly, and Alexander entered, drawn by some instinct that told him he was needed, and the sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks, his mother and wife holding hands while tears streamed down both their faces, a tableau of reconciliation he had never dared hope to witness. "Alexander," his mother said, her voice stronger now, as if confession had indeed been healing, "come here, my son, and let me tell you what I should have said the day you brought this treasure home. That you have chosen better than all the generations of Pembrokes before you, for you have found a woman who sees with the heart, loves with the soul, and will make you happier than any mere beauty or social ornament ever could. And I give you both my blessing and my apology for very nearly destroying with my pride what should have been celebrated with joy." As the morning sun fully claimed the room, banishing the shadows that had seemed so threatening in the depths of night, the three of them sat together in a moment of perfect understanding. The barriers of class and prejudice and pain dissolved in the crucible of truth, and Margaret felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of her place in this family, this home. This life she had entered as a transaction but had claimed through love. And when she met Alexander's eyes across his mother's bed, she saw reflected there not duty or gratitude or even desire, but the kind of bone-deep recognition that spoke of souls finding their match across all the artificial divisions humans created to keep themselves apart. And she knew with a certainty that seemed to rise from the very earth itself that she was no longer the merchant's daughter playing at being countess, but truly Lady Pembroke, beloved wife, cherished daughter, and the beating heart of Somerton Hall. The morning sun streaming through the library windows found Margaret Pembroke seated before the chess set that had witnessed so many of their conversations, her fingers tracing the smooth marble pieces as tears slid silently down her cheeks. For Lady Catherine was recovering in her chambers, and Philip Greville had arrived at dawn with documents that proved what Alexander had suspected all along, that Diana Ashford was nearly bankrupt and had been desperately seeking a wealthy husband among the London ton, her pursuit of Alexander nothing more than a calculated attempt to secure her financial future. And she had fled Somerton Hall in the night like the fraud she was, leaving behind only the ghost of her poisonous words that still echoed in Margaret's heart, despite all evidence to the contrary. When Alexander entered their sanctuary, his breath caught at the sight of her tears, and he moved swiftly to her side, kneeling beside her chair in a gesture that would have shocked society, but felt entirely natural in this space that had become sacred to them both. His hand covering hers on the chess piece she held, a white queen that seemed to mock her with its smooth perfection. "Why do you weep when that harridan has finally shown her true colors and fled?" he asked softly, though he suspected he knew the answer, for Margaret's generous heart found it difficult to rejoice in another's downfall, even when that person had caused her such pain. But she shook her head, her voice breaking as she finally spoke the truth that had been eating at her since Diana's arrival. "I weep because I love you so desperately that it frightens me, and I know I should not. For I am everything she said I was, plain and awkward and utterly unworthy of a man like you, and I fear that I have become the very burden I swore I would never be, falling in love when I promised myself I would be content with cordial arrangement and separate lives." Her confession shattered the last walls between them, and Alexander gently turned her chair to face him fully, remaining on his knees as if in supplication before her, his hands framing her tear-stained face with infinite tenderness as he poured out the truth of his heart with the eloquence of a man who had finally found the words that mattered. "Margaret, my darling, my beloved wife, you speak of being unworthy when you have transformed me from a hollow shell of a man into someone who wakes each morning eager to see what wisdom you will share, what kindness you will show, what brilliant observation you will make about the world around us, and if you are plain, then I have lost all understanding of beauty, for when I look at you, I see the light in your eyes when you speak of something you love, the way your whole face transforms when you smile, the grace in your movements as you tend to everyone around you with such care. And these things are more beautiful to me than all the celebrated diamonds of the ton could ever be." She was sobbing now, her hands clutching his wrists as if to hold him there forever, and he continued with the desperate urgency of a man who had almost lost everything through his own blindness and refused to let another moment pass in misunderstanding. "I fell in love with you the night you quoted Shakespeare to me on our wedding night, speaking of the marriage of true minds, and every day since has only deepened that love, until I can no longer imagine a world without you in it, for you have not saved just my estate, but my very soul, shown me that there is more to life than duty and appearances and the hollow approval of society. And when Diana appeared, I wanted to throw her bodily from our home for daring to dim your light with her cruelty." Margaret's tears had transformed from sorrow to joy, and when she spoke her voice was wondering, as if she could not quite believe this reversal of everything she had thought to be true. "You love me? Truly? Not from duty or gratitude or because I have helped with the estate, but actually love me as a woman, as a wife, as someone you would choose if you had all the choices in the world?" Instead of answering with words, Alexander rose from his knees and pulled her up into his arms, kissing her with all the passion and devotion and desperate need he had been holding back for weeks, and she responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as she kissed him back with the abandon of a woman who had finally allowed herself to believe in love. When they broke apart, both breathing hard and staring at each other with wonder, Alexander noticed the chessboard had been knocked askew in their embrace, pieces scattered across the table, and Margaret laughed, the sound like music after so many days of sorrow. "I should challenge you to a game to settle this properly," she said, her eyes sparkling with the mischief he adored. "But I fear you would be too distracted to play well, for you keep staring at me as if I were something precious, and it quite destroys your concentration, which is why I have beaten you so thoroughly these past weeks." He laughed with her, gathering her close again, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms, how right it felt to hold her this way in the morning light of their library, their sanctuary, their beginning, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I concede defeat in all things, my darling, for you have conquered me completely, and I shall spend the rest of my days staring at you and losing at chess, and counting myself the most fortunate man in England to be so thoroughly beaten by the brilliant, kind, beautiful woman who consented to be my wife." She kissed him again then, softly this time, with the promise of all the mornings to come when they would meet in this room, not as earl and merchant's daughter, not as convenience and duty, but as husband and wife who had found in each other the missing piece of their souls. And when she pulled back to look at him, her face glowing with happiness, she whispered the words he had longed to hear. "I loved you from the moment you took my trembling hand at our wedding and squeezed it gently, letting me know I was not alone, and every day since has only confirmed what my heart knew then, that you are the best man I have ever known, and I choose you, Alexander Pembroke, not for your title or your estate, or anything but the man you are. And I will choose you again tomorrow and every tomorrow after that until the end of our days." The chess pieces lay forgotten as they held each other in the strengthening light. Two souls who had found their way through pride and prejudice and the thoughtless cruelty of the world to this perfect moment of understanding. And outside the library windows, the grounds of Somerton Hall seemed to shimmer with new possibility, the very air charged with the power of love, finally acknowledged, finally claimed, finally free to transform not just two lives, but all the lives their union would touch in the years to come. The great hall of Somerton glowed with the warmth of 100 candles reflecting off crystal and silver. Holly and ivy wound through the ancient beams, while the massive Yule log crackled in the hearth that had warmed Pembroke's for centuries. And Margaret stood at the centre of it all in a gown of deepest crimson silk that caught the light like liquid rubies. The famous Pembroke rubies themselves gleaming at her throat and wrists as she moved among their guests with the natural grace of a woman who knew herself beloved. And Alexander found himself transfixed by the sight of her, just as he had been every day since their reconciliation in the library a month ago, unable to quite believe that this radiant creature, who commanded the room with quiet authority, was the same woman society had dismissed as plain and unfortunate, though of course she was exactly the same person she had always been. Only now the confidence of being truly loved had unveiled what had always existed beneath the surface, like a masterpiece restored to its original glory after years hidden under dust and grime. And as he watched her pause to speak with the vicar about the school she had established for tenant children, her face animated with passion for the project, he marveled at how thoroughly she had transformed not just herself, but their entire world. For Somerton Hall had never been more prosperous. The estate books finally balanced thanks to her sharp mind and merchant training, the tenants thriving under her compassionate attention, and even the stuffiest members of county society had been forced to acknowledge that the Earl of Somerton had chosen far better than anyone had initially believed. Though Alexander cared nothing for their approval, now that he had found something infinitely more precious, in the love of a woman who saw him not as a title or an estate, but simply as the man she had chosen to spend her life beside. And when she caught his gaze across the crowded room and smiled that private smile that was his alone, he felt his heart swell with an emotion too vast for words, remembering all the moments that had brought them to this point, from that first awkward meeting in her father's library to the night she had trusted him enough to share not just her body, but her dreams and fears and brilliant mind. And now, as Lord Pemberton raised his glass to toast the successful harvest and the prosperity that Lady Pembroke had brought to the county, Alexander moved through the crowd to stand beside his wife, his hand finding hers with the ease of long practice. And when the toast was concluded and the attention of the room focused on them, he found himself speaking without conscious plan, his voice carrying clearly through the space as he declared before all assembled that while they honored the harvest and the careful management that had saved the estate from ruin, he wished to honor something far more precious. The woman who had saved not just his lands, but his very soul, who had shown him that true nobility had nothing to do with bloodlines and everything to do with the quality of one's heart and mind. And as he spoke, he was aware of Margaret's hand tightening in his, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and when he concluded by stating that he was and would always be the most fortunate man in England to have won the love of such a woman, the room erupted in genuine applause, for even the most cynical could not deny the truth, written in every glance between them. And then Margaret leaned close to whisper something in his ear, her free hand moving to rest briefly on her stomach, in a gesture so subtle only he would understand its significance. And the words she spoke sent joy coursing through him like lightning, for she had just informed him that their love would bear fruit in the summer, that the next Christmas would find them celebrating with a child of their own, and his happiness was so complete that he couldn't help but pull her into his arms, right there before everyone, kissing her with all the passion and promise and profound gratitude he felt. And when they parted, the entire room seemed to hold its breath before bursting into renewed applause and cheerful congratulation, for a love match was rare enough in their world, but a love match that had triumphed over every obstacle was something to be celebrated, indeed. And as the musicians struck up a waltz and Alexander led Margaret onto the floor, her crimson skirts swirling around them as they moved in perfect harmony, he thought that if someone had told him a year ago that he would find his salvation in a merchant's overlooked daughter, he would have scoffed at the very idea. But now he knew that sometimes the greatest treasures came disguised as necessities, that what seemed like compromise could become completion, and that the woman in his arms, brilliant and kind and carrying their future beneath her heart, was proof that love could transform not just individuals but entire worlds, turning what had begun as a transaction into a truth more precious than all the ancient bloodlines and noble titles that had once seemed so important. And as they danced beneath the portraits of his ancestors, Alexander thought those long-dead Pembrokes would understand and approve, for Margaret had not married into their legacy, but had become its very heart, the beating centre around which all else revolved. And when the dance ended and their guests called for another, he was only too happy to oblige, knowing that he would dance with this woman through all the Christmases to come, through whatever joys or sorrows life might bring, secure in the knowledge that together they had built something stronger than pride, more enduring than prejudice, and more valuable than all the gold that had initially brought them together, but could never have kept them apart once their hearts had recognized their match. The first light of Christmas morning filtered through the frost-etched windows of their bedchamber, painting delicate patterns across the silk hangings and illuminating the snow that fell in soft, steady curtains beyond the glass, transforming the grounds of Somerton Hall into a pristine wonderland that seemed to exist solely for them in this precious hour before the household stirred. And Margaret lay nestled in the circle of Alexander's arms, her head resting against his chest, where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heart. Still marveling at the intimacy of sharing not just a bed, but a life with this man who had transformed from distant stranger to beloved husband in the space of mere months, though it felt as if she had known him forever, as if her soul had been waiting all her life for this completion. And when she shifted slightly to look up at him, she found his eyes already open and watching her with that expression of wonder that never failed to make her heart skip, as if he too could not quite believe their good fortune in finding each other through such unlikely circumstances, and his hand moved to rest gently on the slight swell of her stomach where their child grew, a gesture that had become habitual in the week since she had shared her precious secret, his touch reverent and protective as he imagined the new life they had created together. The tangible proof of their love that would arrive with the summer roses, and Margaret covered his hand with her own, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing, while outside the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in peaceful silence that seemed to cocoon them in their private paradise. And when Alexander spoke, his voice was rough with emotion as he shared his plans for the child's future, not the grand schemes of titles and advantageous matches that his own father had mapped out before he was even born, but simpler dreams of teaching their son or daughter to ride through the estates, to understand the ledgers that kept their people prosperous, to value kindness over pride and wisdom over mere social standing. And Margaret listened with her heart full to bursting, adding her own hopes for their child to know the love of books and learning, to treat all people with dignity regardless of their station, to understand that true nobility came from within rather than from ancient bloodlines or accumulated wealth. And as they planned together in the growing light, she could not resist teasing him gently about their beginning, reminding him of that first meeting in her father's library when he had looked at her plain grey dress and modest appearance, with barely concealed disappointment, seeing only the merchant's daughter who would save his estate rather than the woman who would save his soul. And Alexander groaned at the memory, pulling her closer as if to erase those early moments of blindness, his voice fervent as he insisted that he had been the greatest fool in England to ever think her plain when she was the most beautiful woman he had ever known, not because of any alteration in her appearance, but because her beauty radiated from within, from the brilliant mind that challenged him daily, from the generous heart that saw the best in everyone, from the gentle spirit that had taught him what love truly meant. And to prove his point, he began to trace her features with reverent fingers, cataloguing each beloved detail from the arch of her brows to the curve of her lips, murmuring endearments that would have shocked the ton with their intensity, but felt perfectly natural here in their sanctuary. And Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the depth of emotion in his voice, remembering her own journey from resignation to hope, to this perfect happiness that exceeded anything she had dared to dream during those lonely years of being overlooked and dismissed. And when their lips met in a kiss that began tender and deepened into passion, she thought of all the mornings that stretched ahead of them, all the seasons they would watch change from these windows, all the children who might fill these halls with laughter, all the challenges they would face together with the strength of their united hearts. And when they finally drew apart, breathless and glowing with shared desire, Margaret quoted softly from the sonnet that had become their touchstone, speaking of the marriage of true minds that admits no impediments. And Alexander surprised her by responding not with Shakespeare's words, but with his own, pulling a folded paper from beneath his pillow where he had hidden it, a poem he had written for her in the quiet hours of the night when his love felt too vast for sleep, his voice shaking slightly as he read the verses that spoke of transformation and redemption, of finding home not in ancient stones, but in a pair of intelligent grey eyes, of discovering that the greatest treasures came disguised as necessities, and that what began as duty had become his greatest joy. And by the time he finished, Margaret was crying openly, not bothering to hide her tears as she had once done, for there was no need for such defenses between them now, and she kissed him again with all the love in her overflowing heart, whispering against his lips that he had become quite the poet under her influence, though she suspected he had always possessed such depths and had simply needed someone to recognize them, just as she had needed someone to see past the surface that society deemed unworthy to the woman beneath. And as the bells of the estate chapel began to ring out Christmas morning, calling the household to celebrate the birth of hope itself, they remained entwined in their bed, making love with the tender passion of two souls who had found their perfect match, their bodies speaking all the promises their hearts had made. And afterwards, as they lay peaceful and sated, while the snow continued to fall like a benediction outside their windows, Margaret thought that no Christmas gift could ever compare to this, to lying in the arms of a man who knew every corner of her heart and loved her, not despite her supposed flaws, but because of everything she was. And when Alexander murmured against her hair that next Christmas would find them with a child in their arms, that their love would have taken physical form in a new life to cherish and guide, she could only nod through happy tears, too overwhelmed by the perfection of this moment to speak, knowing that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together with the unshakable foundation of a love that had transformed them both from hollow duty into living joy. The midsummer sun bathed the gardens of Somerton Hall in golden light that seemed to bless the gathering assembled on the emerald lawns, where roses bloomed in riotous profusion, and the gentle breeze carried the sound of laughter and conversation across grounds that had never looked more prosperous or welcoming. And at the heart of this pastoral paradise stood Margaret, Countess of Somerton, resplendent in a gown of jonquil silk that complemented the healthy glow of new motherhood, her arms cradling the precious bundle that was Thomas Philip Alexander Pembroke, future Earl and present centre of his parents' universe, the baby's downy head catching the light as he slept peacefully, despite the gentle hum of admiration from the assembled guests who had come to celebrate not just the birth of an heir, but the complete transformation of what had once been a failing estate into a thriving community. And Alexander stood beside his wife with a pride that went far deeper than mere social satisfaction, his hand resting protectively on her back as he watched her accept congratulations from the very people who had once whispered cruel words about the merchant's plain daughter who dared to reach above her station, though now those same voices spoke only praise for Lady Pembroke's brilliant management of the estate, her innovative agricultural programs that had increased yields by 30%, her school that educated tenant children alongside the offspring of local gentry, and most of all, her gracious manner that had won over even the highest sticklers, including Lady Jersey herself, who had arrived from London specifically to meet the woman who had so thoroughly captured the heart of the formerly aloof Earl of Somerton. And as Margaret moved through the crowd with the natural ease of someone who had found her place in the world, Alexander remembered another gathering not so long ago when she had stood alone and overlooked at their wedding breakfast, enduring snubs and slights with a dignity that had first pricked his conscience and then captured his heart. But now she was the sun around which this entire assembly orbited, sought after for her opinions on everything from estate management to the latest parliamentary debates, her supposed plainness transformed by confidence and joy into a beauty that outshone any merely conventional prettiness. And when she paused to adjust little Thomas's blanket, the gesture so tender and natural that several of the older ladies dabbed at their eyes, Alexander felt his chest tighten with an emotion too vast for words. This woman who had saved not just his estate, but his very soul, who had taught him that true nobility had nothing to do with ancient bloodlines and everything to do with the quality of one's heart, who had given him a son to carry on not just the Pembroke name, but the values of compassion and wisdom she embodied. And as if sensing his thoughts, Margaret looked up and caught his eye, that private smile that was his alone crossing her features, and in that moment he saw not the Countess of Somerton in her silk and jewels, but the quiet girl in grey who had looked him in the eye and spoken truth when everyone else had offered only flattery or calculation, the woman who had beaten him at chess while discussing Wollstonecraft, who had held his mother's hand through her illness and won even that proud lady's genuine affection, who had whispered Shakespeare to him in the darkness and listened to his own halting attempts at poetry with tears in her eyes. And when Lord Ashworth approached to offer his congratulations, mentioning with barely concealed amazement how wrong they had all been about the new countess, Alexander felt only amusement rather than the anger that might once have consumed him. For what did the opinions of such people matter when he had won the greatest prize imaginable in the love of a woman who saw him not as a title or an estate, but simply as the man she had chosen to spend her life beside? And as the afternoon wore on and their guests enjoyed the strawberries and champagne, the children playing on the lawn while their parents discussed the remarkable improvements to the county under Lady Pembroke's influence, Alexander found himself watching his wife with the same wonder he had felt that Christmas morning, when she had told him about the child now sleeping in her arms, marveling at how completely she had transformed not just his world, but his very understanding of what mattered in life. And when she finally made her way back to his side, their son beginning to fuss for his feeding, she leaned into him with the comfortable intimacy of perfect partnership, and murmured that perhaps it was time to retire from the public eye for a while, and he agreed immediately, making their excuses to the assembled company, who watched with indulgent smiles as the Earl and Countess retreated toward the house. No longer the mismatched couple society had mocked, but a pair so obviously meant for each other that even the most cynical could not deny the hand of Providence in bringing them together. And as they walked across the lawn where they had once ridden together that first week of their marriage, when he had begun to see her not as a burden, but as a blessing, Margaret paused to look back at the happy scene they were leaving. The prosperous estate filled with people who had become not just tenants or neighbors, but a true community under her gentle guidance. And when she turned to him with tears in her eyes and said she could hardly believe how far they had come from that awkward first meeting in her father's library, he could only pull her closer and remind her that the best was yet to come, that they had years ahead to watch their son grow, to see the estate flourish under their joint care, to love each other more deeply with each passing season, and as they entered the cool shade of the house where their new life awaited, the sound of their guests' happiness following them like a benediction, Alexander thought that if someone had told him 9 months ago that he would find perfect contentment in the arms of a merchant's daughter, he would have scoffed at the very idea. But now he knew that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as necessities, that what began as duty could transform into joy, and that Margaret, brilliant and kind and holding their future in her arms, was proof that love could indeed conquer all. My dear friends, as I close this tale of unexpected love and profound transformation, I find myself thinking of all those who sit in quiet corners believing themselves overlooked or unworthy of grand passion, and I want to tell you what I have learned through Margaret and Alexander's journey. For their story is not merely a romance between an earl and a merchant's daughter, but a testament to the extraordinary power of being truly seen and valued for who you are beneath the surface that society judges so harshly. And perhaps you too have felt that crushing weight of being deemed not pretty enough or charming enough or accomplished enough by those who mistake glitter for gold, who cannot see that the most precious treasures often come wrapped in the plainest packages. And I think of Margaret in her grey dress, convinced she was destined for a life of quiet resignation, never imagining that she would find a love so deep and true that it would transform not just her own life, but an entire community. For when we believe ourselves worthy of love, when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to show our true selves to another soul, miracles can happen even in the most unlikely circumstances. And Alexander discovered that what he thought was his greatest sacrifice became his greatest blessing, that the woman he married out of desperate necessity became the one person he could not imagine living without. And this is the truth I want to share with you today, that love often finds us when we least expect it, disguised as duty or convenience or mere chance. But if we have the courage to look beyond our preconceptions and society's shallow judgments, we might discover that our supposed weakness is actually our strength, that what others mock or dismiss might be exactly what someone else has been searching for their whole life. And I have seen this truth play out countless times, not just in grand estates and titled marriages, but in ordinary lives where two people find in each other the recognition and validation that the world denied them, where a quiet woman discovers she has a voice worth hearing, and a proud man learns that vulnerability is not weakness, but the greatest courage of all. And so I urge you, dear listener, not to give up hope if you feel invisible or undervalued. For Margaret felt the same until Alexander looked past her simple appearance and saw the brilliant mind and generous heart beneath. And he in turn was transformed from a man frozen by pride and duty into one capable of the deepest love and joy. And their child will grow up knowing that true nobility has nothing to do with bloodlines and everything to do with how we treat others, how we see beyond surfaces to the soul within. And if this story has touched your heart, if it has given you hope that you too might find someone who sees your true worth, then I have succeeded in my purpose. For we all deserve to be loved not despite our supposed flaws, but because of everything that makes us uniquely ourselves. And remember that it is never too late for transformation. Never too late to believe that the best chapters of your life might still be unwritten, waiting for you to have the courage to turn the page. And if you have enjoyed journeying with Margaret and Alexander from that first awkward meeting to their joyful future, I invite you to subscribe and join our community of dreamers and believers who know that the most beautiful love stories are often the ones that begin with the lowest expectations and end with the highest fulfillment. For in the end, love sees what others cannot, values what others dismiss, and transforms what others call plain into something precious beyond measure.